For Christ's sake, can you even hire people who can walk straight? Get her away from that champagne tower before she brings the whole damn thing down. The words, sharp and cold as the ice sculptures bleeding onto the floor, cut through the symphony of clinking glasses and feigned laughter. They were meant to be a whisper, a venomous aside shared between two men in $1,000 suits. But in the vast, gilded ballroom of Manhattan's Sterling Astoria, they carried like a gunshot. Cruelty always finds a way to be heard. And right now, before you get angry, before you judge, I want you to ask yourself a question and be honest with me down in the comments. Have you ever been in a room where you felt completely and utterly invisible? Where your very presence was treated as an inconvenience? If you have, then you know the fire that just ignited in Imani Washington's chest. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, not for me, but for every person who's ever had to swallow their pride just to survive the night. Because you need to stay with me to see how Imani didn't just survive. She took back a piece of her soul they never even knew she had. Imani didn't flinch. She stood, poised and still, a silver tray laden with flutes of shimmering rosé balanced perfectly in one hand. Her simple black uniform was a stark shadow against the blinding sea of couture gowns and diamond-encrusted watches that filled the room. In that moment, to them, she wasn't a person. She was a potential disaster, a background extra in the grand opera of their wealth, a liability near the crystal. The only black waitress on this floor, serving a crowd whose collective net worth could probably erase the debt of a small nation. She placed the last champagne flute down on a waiting table. There was no tremor in her hand, no crack in her posture, no hint of the hurricane roaring behind her eyes. Then, her voice, clear and steady, sliced through the air. It wasn't in English. It was in flawless, tonal Mandarin, the kind spoken in boardrooms in Shanghai, not ballrooms in New York. A tower of glass is fragile, she said, but the honor of the person who built it is even more easily shattered. The silence that followed was absolute. Every head turned. The billionaire who had spat the insult, the titan of industry Elias Vance, froze with a canapé halfway to his mouth. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the scene. A waitress, a black woman he had dismissed as incompetent just seconds before, was now speaking his language of power, the language he used to close billion-dollar deals, and she was speaking it with a poetic grace that made his own attempts sound clumsy and crude. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a checkmate. And this, right here, is not just a story. It's a testament. It's a story about resilience, about the brilliance that society tries to hide in plain sight, and about the silent dignity of those who carry entire worlds within them that no one bothers to see. It's the kind of story that reminds you that your worth is not defined by the uniform you wear or the tray you carry. If that moment gave you chills, if it made you feel that spark of defiance, do one small thing. Hit that subscribe button. Because what Imani did next didn't just reclaim her power for a fleeting moment. It unearthed a history they had all conspired to bury, exposing the rotten foundations upon which their glittering world was built. Stay with me. Imani Washington was never meant to be a shadow. She was forged in the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful crucible of Chicago's South Side. Her world was not one of sterile mansions, but of brownstones alive with the sound of jazz and the smell of her mother's cooking. Her father wasn't a CEO. He was a jazz trumpeter, a man who could make a horn weep or sing with the same effortless grace. He taught Imani about rhythm, not just in music, but in life, in speech. "Language has a beat, baby girl," he'd tell her, his voice a low, smooth rumble. "You gotta find the melody in the words. Some words are sharp, like a high C. Others are smooth, like a bass line. You learn to play 'em right, you can conduct the whole room." Her mother was a history professor at the University of Chicago, a woman who believed that stories were the most powerful artifacts humanity possessed. She saw history not as a collection of dates and wars, but as a library of voices, many of them silenced. Their small apartment was overflowing with books, stacked on floors, crammed into corners, their spines a kaleidoscope of color and knowledge. Words in the Washington household were not just for communication. They were for liberation. They were shelter. They were home. By the time Imani was 10, she was correcting her mother's French translations of historical documents. By 15, she was debating philosophy with her father's bandmates in Spanish. And by 18, she was reading the Tao Te Ching in its original Mandarin, guided by her mother's patient hand, falling in love with the elegant dance of the characters, the profound simplicity of the wisdom held within. She wasn't just learning languages. She was inhaling worlds. At 19, she was the star of Columbia University's Language and Diplomacy program, a full-ride scholar who moved with the quiet confidence of a storm gathering just over the horizon. Her professors spoke of her with a kind of awe. Her peers watched with a mixture of admiration and envy. She could deconstruct a United Nations resolution in Russian faster than most could read the English summary. She once engaged in a debate with a visiting German diplomat about post-war economic policy, and did so with such articulate, respectful precision that the diplomat, stunned, offered her a personal mentorship on the spot. Her dream was clear and sharp: to be a voice for the voiceless, to sit at the tables of power not for the prestige, but to translate the needs of those who were never invited into the room. She was on a trajectory aimed straight at the stars. But life, in its infinite and often cruel wisdom, does not always follow a straight path. 3 weeks before she was set to begin a prestigious fellowship at The Hague, her father collapsed on stage during a performance. The diagnosis was ALS, aggressive, relentless, a brutal thief of muscle and breath. Imani was on a plane back to Chicago within 24 hours. There was no debate, no hesitation, no question. The fellowship was deferred. The dream was put on hold. Her father, the man who taught her the music of language, came first. The next 4 years were a blur of hospital visits, insurance paperwork, and a string of jobs that paid the bills but starved her soul. Barista, office temp, online tutor. Eventually, she landed the waitressing gig at a high-end catering company in New York, a city she'd moved to for a specialized ALS clinic. The work was demanding, the hours were grueling, but the tips were substantial, and they kept her father's complex medical equipment running. Most people who met her during those years saw only the uniform. They saw the polite smile, the efficient movements, the quiet woman who refilled their water without being asked. They didn't see the scholar who could quote Confucius, the diplomat who could negotiate in 3 languages, the daughter of a woman who taught her that history is written by those who insist on being heard, and the child of a man who taught her that sometimes the most powerful note is the one you don't play. And on the night of the gala at the Sterling Astoria, she carried all of that, all of those worlds, all of that history in the silent space behind her eyes. She carried it all in quiet dignity until the quiet was no longer an option. Until the music stopped and it was time for her solo. The gala was a monument to excess, an evening meticulously engineered to stroke the egos of the city's most powerful figures. Hosted at the Sterling Astoria, a palace of marble and gold overlooking Central Park, the event was the crown jewel of New York's social calendar. Valets in crisp military-style uniforms whisked away Lamborghinis and Maybachs as guests draped in silk and diamonds ascended the grand staircase, their reflections dancing in the impossibly polished floors. Inside, the ballroom was a breathtaking spectacle of curated opulence, cascading crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto tables adorned with towering centerpieces of exotic white orchids and peonies. The air was thick with the scent of money, a heady mix of expensive perfume, vintage wine, and a floral fragrance so potent it seemed to have a price tag. This was a fundraising event for Vance Global Holdings' philanthropic arm, but its true purpose was a naked display of power, a living, breathing map of the city's hierarchy. Where you sat, who you spoke to, who ignored you, it all mattered. Imani wasn't supposed to be there. Her company usually handled smaller, more discreet events, but the Astoria's regular staff had been stretched thin by a last-minute VIP booking, and her agency was called in to provide backup. Just for tonight, her manager had told her, his eyes already calculating the bonus. Keep your head down. Stay invisible. The tips will be legendary. She hadn't argued. Her father's new respiratory machine wasn't fully covered by insurance. The rent was due. So she pulled her intricate braids into a tight, elegant bun, ensured her shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and walked into the lion's den with a tray in her hand and the full weight of her ancestors at her back. The moment she stepped onto the ballroom floor, she felt the familiar chill. 100 pairs of eyes sweeping over her, through her, dismissing her in a single, collective glance. She was, as far as they were concerned, part of the furniture, and her blackness made her both hyper-visible and completely unseen. She moved with a practiced grace, her steps measured and silent, her focus absolute. She approached table 7, the King's Court, where Elias Vance himself held court, flanked by hedge fund managers, tech moguls, and their immaculately preserved wives. And that's when the slow, casual cruelty began its overture. It began, as it so often does, as a joke for an audience of bullies. As Imani approached table 7, her expression was serene, a mask of professional calm she had perfected over years of practice. She moved around the table, placing delicately folded linen napkins at each setting, ensuring the silver fork was precisely 1 inch from the edge of the charger plate. She had learned long ago that perfection was a form of camouflage. If every detail was flawless, they had no reason to look at the person providing it. But her invisibility cloak was malfunctioning tonight. "My God, look at the hair!" a woman draped in emerald silk hissed, her voice a stage whisper designed to be overheard. She was speaking to the man beside her, a smirking financier whose face was a familiar fixture on cable news. "It's so elaborate. Is that a cultural thing?" The man chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "It's a thing, all right." Imani said nothing. She had fielded questions about her braids since kindergarten. This was amateur hour. Another guest, a younger man with the soft, unlined face of inherited wealth, leaned forward, swirling a blood-red Bordeaux in his glass. He watched Imani as she refilled his water, his eyes cold and clinical, as if observing a curious specimen. "You think she even knows what half this food is?" he asked the table at large. "Probably thinks foie gras is a French car." The laughter was sharper this time, a volley of polite, polished daggers. Imani continued her circuit, her movements fluid and unbroken. She adjusted a knife. She cleared a bread plate. She offered a polite, closed-mouth smile to no one in particular. Then, Elias Vance spoke. He was the center of gravity at the table, a man whose presence filled every inch of space around him. He leaned back, his custom-tailored suit unbuttoned, a glass of impossibly expensive whiskey in his hand. His voice was a smooth, deep baritone, but it was coated in a thick layer of condescension. He said something in Mandarin, and the men at the table who understood it erupted in laughter. It wasn't a joke. It was an execution. He had looked directly at Imani, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and said, "This one reminds me of the factory workers in Shenzhen. You can put them in a uniform, but they still have the clumsy hands of a peasant." The insult landed with the force of a physical blow, not just because of the words themselves, but because of the language he chose. He had used the language of global commerce, of power and intellect, to paint her as a worthless, clumsy animal. And the room, in its complicity, did nothing. The laughter was loud, full-throated, the sound of wolves congratulating their pack leader. Imani paused. Her tray was still in her hand. For a single roaring second, she felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the ghost of her father's voice in her ear telling her to find the rhythm, to wait for her moment. Her face, however, remained a placid lake. She had spent a lifetime learning to wear calm, like a suit of armor. She turned, set the tray on a nearby stand with a soft, deliberate click, and straightened to her full height. Her voice, when it finally came, would not be a shout. It would be a symphony. Imani let the final ripples of their laughter die out, giving the silence a moment to pool in the center of the table. Her pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were as steady as stone as she picked up a clean napkin and began to polish an already gleaming wine glass. Her back was ramrod straight, her chin held not in defiance, but in a quiet, unshakable self-possession. For a breath, she was just a waitress performing a mundane task. Then, she lifted her head. Her eyes, deep and luminous, met Elias Vance's. They were calm, clear, and held his gaze without a flicker of fear. He was still smirking, the arrogant victor, certain she was just another piece of scenery, oblivious to the knife he'd just slid between her ribs. He was wrong. In perfect, classical Mandarin, the language of scholars and poets, not the clipped, functional dialect of the boardroom, Imani spoke. "A tower of glass is fragile," she said, her tones precise, her cadence lyrical, but the honor of the person who built it is even more easily shattered. The effect was instantaneous. The air in the ballroom seemed to crystallize. Elias Vance's smirk dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. The whiskey glass in his hand tilted, a single amber drop escaping to stain the pristine white tablecloth. The woman in the emerald dress stopped blinking. The financier beside her choked on a laugh, turning it into a sputtering cough. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The words hadn't just been a rebuttal. They were a work of art. They were layered, profound, and delivered with a fluency that bespoke a lifetime of study, not a handful of memorized phrases. It was the linguistic equivalent of a peasant girl picking up a sword and disarming the king's champion with a single, elegant move. Vance struggled to regain his composure, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. A flicker of something primal crossed his eyes. Shock, humiliation, and perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, fear. He knew that Mandarin. He knew the depth of the proverb. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had understood every single syllable of his insult. Imani didn't press her advantage. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her statement was more damning than any accusation. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of finality, a subtle, graceful bow that was not one of subservience, but of closure. Then she turned, retrieved her tray, and moved toward the next table as if nothing had happened, leaving a crater of stunned silence in her wake. Around the ballroom a new sound began to ripple outwards, replacing the laughter. It was the sound of whispers, cautious, urgent whispers. "Did you hear that? Was that Mandarin?" "Perfectly. My God, who is she?" Across the table, a young woman stared after Imani, her gaze intense, her perfectly manicured hands clenched in her lap. It was Maya Vance, Elias's daughter. Her expression was a complex tapestry of shock, shame, and something that looked terrifyingly like admiration. The balance of power in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been utterly and completely capsized. The truth about Imani Washington wasn't a secret she guarded. It was a history she carried. It lived in the quiet cadence of her voice, in the way she pronounced foreign names with flawless accuracy, in the subtle straightening of her spine whenever she overheard an ignorant comment about a culture someone knew nothing about. But in a world that judges books by their covers, no one had ever bothered to read past the first page of her uniform. If they had, they would have seen the scholar who, at 20, delivered a keynote address on post-colonial literature at a conference in Brussels, switching effortlessly between English, French, and Swahili. They would have seen the articles in academic journals praising her prodigious talent and once-in-a-generation mind. Her name had been whispered in the hallowed halls of the State Department, mentioned as a future Fulbright scholar, a potential Rhodes. Her dream hadn't been forged in a desire for fame or fortune. It was simpler, purer. She wanted to build bridges. She believed language was the raw material, and empathy was the architecture. She wanted to ensure that no one was ever silenced simply because they spoke a different tongue. That singular focus had fueled her through marathon study sessions, grueling translation exams, and an unwavering quest for knowledge. Then came the phone call that shattered her world. ALS, a disease that strips you of your voice, your movement, your very breath. It was a cruelly ironic sentence for the father of a linguist. She left her fellowship program the day after the diagnosis. There was no discussion. The deans and professors pleaded with her, promising to hold her spot, to offer extensions. She thanked them politely and hung up the phone. Her father, the man whose trumpet had been the soundtrack to her life, was her world. Every word she had ever mastered, every dialect she had perfected, it had all started with him, tapping out rhythms on the kitchen table, teaching her that every sound had meaning. The years that followed were a crucible. She became a full-time caregiver, a warrior navigating the labyrinthine American healthcare system. She worked jobs that fit between doctor's appointments and physical therapy sessions. The languages were still there, but they went quiet, dormant, buried beneath prescription names and insurance claim numbers. After her father passed, a quiet, dignified end to a brutal fight, Imani was adrift. The path back to academia felt alien, the accolades hollow. She just needed to breathe. She just needed to survive. New York was unforgivingly expensive, but the catering job offered anonymity and a steady paycheck. The silence of the work gave her the space to grieve, to heal. She had convinced herself that the scholar, the diplomat, the speaker of 6 languages, was a person from another life. A ghost until tonight. Until Elias Vance, in his blind arrogance, had handed her a reason to resurrect her. The silence that had fallen over Table 7 was heavy, suffocating. The guests stared at their plates, their reflections, anywhere but at each other. The air crackled with unspoken recriminations. But arrogance, like a weed, is not so easily uprooted. From the other side of the table, a man named Julian Croft leaned forward, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He was a notorious hedge fund manager, a man who built his empire by shorting the dreams of others, and he relished a good fight. "A poetic tongue, to be sure," Croft said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He tapped a manicured finger against his wine glass. "A well-rehearsed line. But let's see if the parrot knows more than one trick." Elias Vance, desperate to deflect the spotlight of his own humiliation, gave Croft a subtle, encouraging nod. He needed an ally to help put this upstart waitress back in her place. Croft switched to Mandarin, his tone sharp and academic, the language of a hostile takeover. "Tell me then," he challenged, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "do you believe China's Belt and Road Initiative in East Africa is a genuine form of sustainable development, or is it merely a neo-colonial debt trap designed to secure strategic assets?" The question was a landmine. It was complex, politically charged, and designed to expose her as a fraud. Several guests, recognizing the intellectual weight of the question, leaned in, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel anticipation. They were waiting for her to falter, to prove their initial assessment of her was correct. Imani turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on Julian Croft. Her face was an unreadable mask of calm. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stammer. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the authority of absolute knowledge. Her Mandarin was so crisp, so erudite, that it made Croft's sound like a child's approximation. She began by deconstructing his premise, pointing out the flawed Western-centric bias in the term debt trap diplomacy. She then proceeded to deliver a breathtakingly concise analysis, citing specific infrastructure projects in Djibouti and Kenya, quoting recent trade statistics from the IMF, and even referencing a lesser-known speech by the African Union chairperson from 3 months prior. She concluded by offering a nuanced perspective on post-colonial agency, arguing that to view African nations as mere pawns was to perpetuate the very colonial mindset the initiative was often accused of. Her analysis wasn't just impressive, it was masterful. It was the kind of sharp, insightful commentary one would expect at a Council on Foreign Relations roundtable, not from a waitress clearing dinner plates. Julian Croft stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He slowly, almost involuntarily, nodded. "Remarkable," he muttered, switching back to English, the fight completely drained from him. Across the table, a woman who worked at the UN embassy let out a low whistle. That was better than our last internal briefing." Elias Vance said nothing, but his hand, resting on the table, had curled into a tight, white-knuckled fist. For the second time in 10 minutes, Imani had redefined herself. She had flipped the board, changed the rules, and no one in the room knew how to play her game. Imani stood for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle into the room's stunned consciousness. The whispers had stopped. The air was still, thick with a mixture of shock and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached into the small, hidden pocket of her apron. The gesture was simple, almost mundane, but it riveted every eye in the room. It was not a grand, theatrical motion, but it carried the gravity of a final, unanswerable move in a game of chess. From the pocket, she withdrew a single, folded envelope. It was worn, the edges soft from handling, the paper slightly creased, but the logo in the top left corner was sharp, unmistakable. The stylized V of Vance Global Holdings. The moment Elias Vance saw it, the last vestiges of color drained from his face. A crack appeared in his carefully constructed mask of invincible power. "I was cleaning out an old box last month," Imani said, her voice even and quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "I found this. I almost threw it away, but I couldn't. I guess I needed a reminder that it was real." She held the envelope up. Not as a weapon, but as an artifact, a piece of a life they had all assumed she couldn't possibly have lived. "It's a letter," she continued, her eyes fixed on Elias Vance. "A formal letter of acceptance for the Vance Global Diplomatic Fellowship. It offered a full scholarship and a mentorship, signed by the CEO himself." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It's dated 5 years ago." A collective gasp, soft but audible, swept through the room. It was a sound of dawning comprehension, of a narrative being violently rewritten in real time. I was the top candidate that year, she added, her voice devoid of pride, stating it as a simple, verifiable fact. I was set to be your mentee. I was supposed to be sitting at tables like this one, but life had other plans. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to speak of her father, of the hospitals, of the sacrifice. The worn envelope in her hand told a story far more powerful than any she could have articulated. Elias Vance's face was a blank slate of shock. No words came. He stared at the letter as if it were a specter, a ghost from a past he had personally signed off on, but had never bothered to remember. He had approved a name on a piece of paper, never once considering the brilliant human being attached to it. I never formally rejected the offer, Imani said, her tone calm, free of accusation. My father got sick before I had the chance to reply. The deadline passed. But I've always wondered, she said, her eyes finally locking with his. If I had walked into your office back then, wearing a suit instead of this apron, would you have even recognized the name you signed? Silence. A profound, deafening silence. No one moved. No one coughed. No one dared to breathe. Because the question was not a question. It was a mirror, held up to every person in that room, reflecting their own prejudices, their own lazy assumptions, their own quiet, daily decisions to judge a person's worth by the clothes on their back or the job on their name tag. If you are feeling that fire in your chest right now, that righteous anger for every time someone has been judged unfairly, then I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. Because the story isn't over. What happens next, the fallout from this moment, is where the real truth comes out. You won't want to miss it. Imani gently folded the letter and slid it back into her apron pocket, tucking the past away once more. Then she turned to the woman sitting next to Elias Vance. More champagne, ma'am? She asked, her voice perfectly level. But the room was no longer the same. And in their eyes, neither was she. The silence that followed Imani's question was not merely awkward, it was charged, electric, humming with the ghost of 1,000 unspoken apologies. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the gilded room transformed into a courtroom where every guest was a juror, forced to reconsider their verdict. No one touched their wine. No one dared to speak. Until Maya. Maya Vance had been sitting perfectly still, a marble statue of a daughter. In that moment, she looked nothing like the imperious man beside her. There was no trace of his arrogance, none of his calculated froideur. There was only a profound and terrible clarity in her wide, intelligent eyes. She felt the weight of her entire life, a life lived in rooms just like this one, pressing down on her chest. With a quiet grace that belied the tremor in her hands, she stood up. The soft scrape of her chair against the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. It was a delicate sound, yet it broke the spell. She didn't look at her father. She walked slowly, purposefully, around the table and stopped directly in front of Imani, who had just begun to clear away a used plate. Everyone watched, holding their breath. "I am so sorry," Maya said, her voice quiet but ringing with a sincerity that was undeniable. She spoke to Imani, but her words were an indictment of everyone present, including herself. Imani looked up, her expression guarded, uncertain of the motive. But Maya's gaze was unwavering. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning. "I have spent my entire life in rooms like this," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have watched people, good, brilliant people, be dismissed, ignored, and humiliated because of how they look, or where they're from, or the uniform they're wearing, and I have sat in silence, every single time. My silence was a vote for the cruelty, and that makes me just as guilty." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. This was not part of the evening's program. This was real. Then, something extraordinary happened. A woman at a neighboring table, a senior diplomat from Kenya with a formidable reputation, stood up. She was dressed in a vibrant blue gown, a stark contrast to the muted tones of the room. "She is right," the diplomat said, her voice resonating with authority. "For far too long, too many of us have stayed silent while the rooms of power grow colder and more exclusive." She crossed her arms, a gesture not of defense, but of solidarity. One by one, like the first drops of a coming storm, others began to rise. A silver-haired federal judge, known for his stern demeanor, nodded slowly and pushed back his chair to stand. A young, fiercely progressive tech CEO stood, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes locked on Imani with an expression of profound respect. Even a world-famous actor, who had been trying to remain incognito at a back table, rose to his feet with a solemn bow of his head. It was not a universal uprising. Many guests remained seated, their posture stiff, their faces masks of indignation or discomfort. To them, this was a breach of protocol, a disruption of the natural order. But the room had irrevocably tilted on its axis. The smug laughter had been replaced by a heavy, reflective silence. The smirks had been supplanted by downcast eyes and troubled brows. And in the center of it all stood Imani, not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. A quiet, dignified woman who had, with a few well-chosen words and the truth of her own history, forced a room full of the world's most powerful people to finally look in the mirror. She hadn't asked for their support. She hadn't needed a savior. But the fact that it came, the fact that they finally, truly saw her, was a quiet revolution in itself. But power, especially the kind built on generations of unexamined privilege, does not yield the floor gracefully. Ego is a cornered animal, and it will bite before it retreats. At the far end of the table, a man in a blindingly white dinner jacket, a real estate mogul with a reputation for casual brutality, leaned back in his chair. He had not stood. He crossed his arms, a smirk of deep-seated cynicism twisting his lips. He scanned the standing guests as if they were fools who had fallen for a cheap magic trick. "She speaks well," he drawled, his voice a sandpaper rasp. "But so do parrots. It's a good act." The comment landed with a sickening thud. A few nervous, sycophantic chuckles followed, the sound of people desperate to realign themselves with the familiar cruelty of the powerful. "Just watch," someone else whispered from a nearby table. "The mask will slip." Elias Vance, still reeling but sensing a chance to regain control, seized the opening. His pride, battered and bleeding, pushed him to reassert his dominance. He cleared his throat, a loud, commanding sound that demanded attention. "Let us not get carried away by a moment of theatricality," he said, his voice dripping with forced magnanimity. "This is a waitress, a remarkably talented one, I'll grant you. But let's maintain perspective. She serves drinks, not foreign policy." There it was, the final, desperate attempt to shrink her back into her uniform, to put her back in the box they had created for her. The insistence that brilliance, when found in an unexpected place, must be a fluke, an illusion. Imani did not deign to respond with words. Her silence was a far more powerful rebuttal. She simply continued her work, her movements economical and precise. She placed a clean fork beside a plate. Her composure was a fortress. And yet, the poison of their arrogance lingered in the air, a stubborn, sour stench. It wasn't just Vance and his cronies. It was in the stiff posture of every guest who remained seated, their guilt curdling into resentment. They were too proud to apologize, too invested in the hierarchy to admit it had been shaken. The old rules were still standing, but their foundations were riddled with cracks. Imani continued to work, her face a mask of professional serenity, but a new kind of gaze followed her around the room. It was no longer the dismissive scan of the elite. This was a look of grudging respect, of fear, of uncertainty. It was the look people give when they have just profoundly, and perhaps permanently, underestimated the wrong person. Just as the tension seemed to be calcifying into a new, uneasy status quo, Maya Vance moved again. She reached into her impossibly small, elegant clutch, her hands no longer shaking, and pulled out her smartphone. Not a letter, not a piece of paper, something far more modern and far more devastating. She stood once more, her stance resolute. "My mother," she said, her voice clear and strong, "was a philanthropist. But before that she was an academic. She believed that potential was the world's most squandered resource. She kept meticulous records, audio notes, on everything." Imani looked at her, a flicker of surprise in her otherwise calm eyes. Maya swiped her thumb across the screen, and a voice filled the silent ballroom. It was a woman's voice, warm, intelligent, and imbued with a gentle authority. It was the voice of the late Helena Vance, Elias's wife, a woman beloved in the city for her quiet grace and fierce intelligence. The recording was an audio note she had dictated to her assistant years ago. Her voice echoed through the grand ballroom, a ghost at the feast. "Regarding the fellowship candidates," Helena's voice said, "the board is leaning toward the senator's son. He's the safe choice. But there's another one, an Imani Washington from Columbia. Her essays are breathtaking. She writes about language not as a tool for transactions, but as a vessel for truth. This one has a fire in her, Elias." The voice on the recording seemed to be pleading with her husband. "She understands that power isn't about speaking, it's about being heard. She's the one we should be betting on. She is the future." A collective intake of breath. The name, her name, spoken with such reverence by the woman whose legacy this entire gala was meant to honor. Elias Vance went bone white. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. His wife, his late wife, had seen the truth of Imani 5 years ago. He had ignored her. "My mother remembered you," Maya said softly, turning off the recording. "She believed in you. Even when no one else in this room, including my father, even knew your name." For a long, silent moment, no one breathed. Imani stood completely still, the silver tray in her hand forgotten. A single slow tear traced a path down her cheek, but she did not let it fall. It was not a tear of sadness, but of a validation so long overdue it felt like a physical release, like a bone finally setting back into place. Something shifted in her stance, a subtle unburdening of a weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. Maya walked over and gently took the tray from Imani's hand, setting it on the table. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. She did not offer pity, she offered equality. Imani looked at her and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. Then she turned back to the stunned, silent table. "Would anyone care for coffee?" she asked, her voice perfectly smooth, her professionalism an act of defiance in itself. It was a simple question, but it landed with the force of a royal decree. Because in that moment, there was not a single person at that table who could deny who she was. Not a waitress, not a prop, a woman of immeasurable honor. And the proof was no longer just in her words. It was in the legacy she unknowingly carried. By the time the sun rose over the East River, the story had gone supernova. Someone at the gala, a junior associate at a rival firm, had discreetly filmed the entire exchange on their phone. The video was shaky, the audio slightly muffled by the ballroom's acoustics, but the raw power of the moment was undeniable. It showed Imani's calm, poetic rebuttal. It captured Julian Croft's arrogant challenge and her masterful dismantling of it. It showed the letter, Maya's stand, and the final devastating audio recording. The video was posted to Twitter at 2:15 a.m. with a simple caption, "Waitress at a Billionaire's gala in NYC puts the host in his place in flawless Mandarin." By dawn, it was a global phenomenon. Hashtags like Touched Imani Washington, Touched the Sterling Slam, and Vance Global Shame were trending worldwide. The clip exploded across every platform, from TikTok, where teenagers set her words to dramatic music, to LinkedIn, where CEOs debated the corporate culture implications. Within 12 hours, it had surpassed 50 million views. It was replayed on morning news shows from New York to New Delhi. Journalists dug into her past, unearthing her academic achievements. Activists and celebrities reposted the clip, adding their own messages of support. Memes of Elias Vance's stunned face became instant classics. Quote cards with her Mandarin proverb were shared millions of times. The comments section was a tidal wave of emotion. "The absolute grace under fire. I have chills. This is a masterclass in how to deal with bullies." She said what every service worker has dreamed of saying for a century, a true queen. But with the praise came the inevitable consequences. Elias Vance's name was suddenly toxic. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Several high-profile members of his company's board of directors called for an emergency meeting. By noon, Vance Global Holdings released a painfully generic corporate statement. "We are aware of the incident and are conducting a full internal review. We are committed to fostering an environment of respect and inclusivity." No one bought it. Major sponsors for an upcoming real estate development began pulling out. A powerful ESG investment fund, managed entirely by women, publicly announced they were divesting their entire portfolio from Vance Global. Media outlets, smelling blood in the water, started re-examining his entire career, unearthing a pattern of ruthless behavior and casual cruelty. He wasn't canceled, not in a single day. But the thick, impenetrable armor of his reputation had been pierced, and his legacy was bleeding out for the world to see. Universities began using the clip as a case study in intercultural communication and power dynamics. An anonymous donor contacted Columbia University and, within 48 hours, established the Imani Washington Fellowship for Language and Diplomacy, dedicated to supporting gifted students of color from underprivileged backgrounds. Through it all, Imani herself remained silent. She didn't post a thing. She didn't answer the hundreds of calls from reporters. She showed up for her next scheduled shift at a wedding in Brooklyn, as if nothing had happened. The paparazzi found her, of course, their flashes creating a chaotic storm outside the venue. Fans left flowers, books, and letters for her at her catering company's office. One little girl from the Bronx drew a picture of a superhero wearing an apron, holding a tray in one hand and a book in the other. Underneath, she had written, "Words are a superpower." Her manager, overwhelmed, tried to give Imani paid leave. She politely refused. "I didn't do it for this," she told him quietly. "I did it because I was tired of being silent." And that simple, profound truth was why the story resonated so deeply. Because while the world was busy debating the complex politics of class, race, and language, Imani had already won her war. She had spoken her piece. And in a world filled with endless noise, it was the quiet, unshakable dignity of her truth that had finally made everyone listen. A week passed. As it always does, the relentless churn of the news cycle began to move on. A new political scandal, a new celebrity meltdown. The world's outrage is a fickle and fleeting thing. But for those who had been in that ballroom, for those who had watched the video and felt its truth in their bones, the story was not over. Something fundamental had been altered. Imani tried to return to her life. She stopped taking shifts at high-profile events, opting for quieter, smaller gatherings where she could blend in. But she was no longer invisible. Her colleagues, who had once known her as the quiet, reliable one, now looked at her with a kind of reverence. The kitchen staff, a mix of immigrants from all corners of the globe, started calling her La Maestra, the teacher. The owner of the catering company offered her an executive position, a role in management. She politely declined. "I'm not looking for a new title," she explained. "I'm just trying to find my footing again." Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Maya Vance found her. She didn't show up with a security detail or a flood of reporters. She arrived alone, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, at a small community center in Queens, where Imani had started volunteering, teaching English to recent immigrants. Maya waited patiently until the class was over. In her hands, she held a worn, leather-bound journal. "It was my mother's," Maya said, her voice soft. She kept notes on people who inspired her, people she met, people she read about, people she wanted to fund. She opened the journal to a dog-eared page. "She had a page for you. She wrote it after she read your fellowship application all those years ago. I thought you should have it." Imani took the journal, her fingers tracing the elegant, faded handwriting. She didn't read it right away. Some words deserve the sanctity of silence. Maya smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "My mother used to say that some people build empires of steel and glass, and some people build empires of the mind. She always believed the second kind was stronger." She looked at Imani, her eyes filled with a respect that transcended their different worlds. "You didn't just prove her right, you honored her." Imani nodded, a feeling of closure settling over her, quiet and warm. "Your mother," she said, her voice low with emotion, "was the first person in that world who really saw me." Outside the community center, a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing down the street. One of them, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, paused and pointed through the window. She whispered to her mother in Spanish, "Mama, Mira, that's her, the lady who speaks all the languages." Imani watched them go, a gentle smile finally touching her lips. Not every story needs a grand, cinematic ending. Not every victory is marked by a ticker-tape parade. Sometimes victory looks like a worn journal in your hands. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet peace that comes from reclaiming your own narrative. And sometimes it feels like standing in a small room in Queens, helping someone else find their voice, knowing that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Not because someone else finally let you in, but because you built the room yourself. That was victory. That was power. And for Imani Washington, that had always been more than enough. Dignity, true dignity, rarely shouts. It doesn't need to slam its fist on the table or demand to be seen. True dignity has a quiet strength. It speaks its truth in a clear, steady voice, and then waits, with infinite patience, for the rest of the world to catch up. Imani's story is a powerful, burning reminder that our value is not determined by our job title, our zip code, or the ignorant assumptions people project onto us. Our value is forged in the fire of our character. It is measured by how we carry ourselves when we are being tested, how we speak our truth when no one expects us to have a voice, and how we refuse to be diminished when the world tries to make us small. What Imani did in that ballroom wasn't just about her mastery of Mandarin. It was about her mastery of self. It was about standing in a space that was designed to make her feel insignificant and refusing, with every fiber of her being, to shrink. And that, perhaps, is the lesson for all of us. You do not have to raise your voice to be heard. You do not have to break down the door to make your way into the room. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act you can commit is to simply know, deep in your bones, who you are, and then have the courage to act like it, no matter who is watching. So, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been underestimated, if you have ever had to bite your tongue and swallow words that deserved to be spoken, this story is for you. It's a tribute to your quiet strength. And if it resonated with you, even for a moment, do me one last favor. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you found your voice. Share this video with one person who needs to be reminded of their own power. And hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story we tell. Because stories like this one, they don't just entertain us. They arm us. They remind us who we are and who we have the power to become.